Hi everyone, it's Mr. Barden here. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about phasing, what it is, how you can avoid it when you're setting up your microphones to record. So, in order to help with that, I have got Studio One opened up right here. You can see it right there. I've got connected to a Presonus Studio 68C interface, and I have two different microphones. All right. Well, I say two different ones, two separate microphones. They're both Shure SM57s. So, what I'm going to do is be able to show you what phasing is, how you can avoid it, how you can fix it, and we'll be making a little bit of phasing in this video. So, basically, what phasing is when you're recording one sound source with different microphones. Okay, and when those microphones are, improperly placed in relation to each other, then basically the sound wave will be hitting the microphone at a different portion. So maybe if we're hitting it at this time, the sound wave would be at a different spot here than it is here. But because of that, that's what's called out of phase. So again, if my microphones were placed directly, in the right spot in relation to whatever I was recording, then we wouldn't have any problems. But if one was maybe a bit too close, or they were, just off from each other, then the sound waves would be hitting the microphones at different portions of time from when I started making them. So let's just say I had this one, kind of far away, this other one really close, and I made a noise, then the sound would hit this microphone before it would hit this microphone. And when we would play them back together, they would sound out of phase. If they're far enough apart, it'll sound more like a delay rather than it just being a few samples off from each other. Where this becomes a problem is when we start to play that audio back. Because they're out of phase, once you combine sounds, if one's really high and one's really low, it's going to average them together. And if they're completely out of phase, the sounds completely cancel each other out. That's why it's really noticeable with similar or identical microphones. It's definitely possible to happen with different kinds of microphones, but I find it more noticeable if the microphones respond the same or very similarly to the sound. This will probably be the most common, again, if you happen to have a lot of microphones miking one thing. So let's say you put a mic on top or below your snare drum, you would potentially get phasing right there, or in front of or behind an amplifier. And the idea with this is that as the sound source moves towards one microphone, it's increasing that air pressure. But if the microphone's on the other side, will be decreasing it, and that's where they start to get that phasing issue. So even though it's a very, very common technique to mic, the top and bottom of a snare drum or the front and back of a guitar amplifier, you have to play around with some of the phasing options that we have in order to avoid that. That's the boring part out of the way. Let's actually talk about what this sounds like. So I've got Studio One set up, and I am going to set these up to record, but I'm just going to mute my master output for now, just so we don't have any issues before I need to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by putting these microphones, right next to each other. Hello, hello. Okay, this is input one. So you can see I'm talking more into this one, and now I'm talking more into this one. Just by moving it further away, one's already much, much quieter. So I'm going to start with them, right next to each other, super close to me, and then we're going to move them further and further apart, and then further and further back, and then those should still be relatively in phase to each other. Whenever you're playing with multiple microphones, to help avoid phasing, the general rule is 3-1. So however far apart you are from the source, make your microphones about, at least 3 times that distance from each other. And that should generally help with the phasing. Again, assuming that they're both the same distance from the sound source. So I'm going to be recording all of this, and then I'll play it all back for you, so you'll be able to hear it, through my separate microphone over here that StudioOne isn't looking at. So let's record. So at this point, the microphones are literally right next to each other. As I'm talking now, I am separating them, but keeping them, pointed to the same sound source, same distance from the sound source. I'm now scooting both microphones further and further away. And then I'm going to pull in one a lot closer than the other. I'll put them both at about the same distance, and I will pull in the other one for, the other comparison. And now the microphones are right next to each other again. Okay, so those are there. I'm just gonna undo those, and then I'll just it's Option in. Just normalize those so we can see them a bit better. And if we zoomed way in, let's just do this for example, we can see that generally they're pretty much in phase to, at certain points whenever they're right next to each other. But there are times when they're going to be out of phase or, slightly off. I'm way zoomed in, so let's find here's a section. So again, we've got one happening with basically no pickups there. Again, as we move around to different sizes, and it's just slightly different things. So let's just play it back, and that'll kind of show a lot of what I'm talking about. One moment. I just realized that I should make my playback device those. Okay. Now, so at this point, the microphones are literally right next to each other. As I'm talking now, I am separating them, but keeping them, pointed to the same sound source, same distance from the sound source. I'm now scooting both microphones further and further away. And then I'm going to pull in one a lot closer than the other. I'll put them both at about the same distance, and I will pull in the other one for, the other comparison. And now the microphones are right next to each other again. So hopefully that'll come through. I'll put a link to that little exported audio down below. What I'm wanting to pull up and show specifically is just how much thinner and weaker this middle portion right about here sounded compared to when both the microphones were, essentially in the exact same spot, or they were quieter, but it was still pretty much in phase for this first half and the very end. This is what will happen, with your instruments and recording, but to be honest, it'll probably be a bit more noticeable with those louder instruments and the more direct placing where you're really trying to get a very specific sound. This was me just kind of moving it around and trying a few things. In order to adjust this, we can play around with a few different options, and kind of the best one, or maybe the most straightforward, just make sure I'm not missing a thing, is this one, and we'll see if things have changed. Mixtool. So if we pull up Mixtool, this is a plugin in StudioOne that is very handy. So for this, we can adjust the gain on a track, or we can very easily invert the polarity of the signal. So basically, This just means that instead of the lines going up here, it'll now flip it and go the opposite direction. So if we happen to have, the things on separate sides, you can just flip it in order to, make those things be in phase again, and then they don't cancel each other out. That's the really easy version. There's other plugins and things we can play around with in order to manually shift that phase by just a little bit. But if, try swapping them around and seeing if that helps before you start going and finding more plugins to download. That's it in a nutshell. Again, I didn't do anything that we needed to swap the phase of, but again, just to reiterate all of this, whenever you have 2 or more microphones on one particular source, then you run the risk of those microphones being out of phase. And again, that is just when the sound source reaches the microphones at different times, but you're still playing them back. If the microphones are too far apart, then one will it'll sound more like a delay. But when they're a lot closer, it's usually just off by a few samples. And then also when they're out of phase, being on separate directions of a sound source, then, they'll be moving in up. One might be up and it'll be going down. And when they combine together to play them, it cancels out. Hopefully that wasn't awkward. Trying to illustrate the flat line. But that's essentially it. If you happen to have a microphone that's out of phase, but was still about the same distance, you can just use the mix tool in order to invert or not invert that sound source. This little logo here of the circle with the slash through it, like this, is used to represent, the option of inverting a phase. So if your interface happens to be able to do that, that's great. Not all of them can. Or some other piece of gear you have has this on there, that's what that is. So you notice, something's not quite right, you can try inverting the phase, and that will help avoid the thin sound that comes with being out of phase. That's going to be it from me today. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you learned something, definitely consider, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff. It's very, very helpful. This is where I'm going to end it off, and I will see you all the next time that I see you. Bye.